This is a production of Cornell University.
So you have not accidentally wandered into an entomology talk. This is actually a horticulture talk, but because it's an insect that affects a lot of potential plants, it's something that I thought people would be of interest to the horticulture seminar group. Also, and Nina noticed, I actually do have a doorstep on my a picture of a doorstep, so we'll get to that and explain it a little bit more. So I'm going to ask you questions to start out, because it's lunchtime and I have to keep everybody awake. How many people have already heard of spotted lanternfly? Very good. How many of you are from Pennsylvania? That helps. Okay, so that's a start. All right. Are there spotted lanternfly populations in New York State at the moment?
No. I think yes.
Okay, so we have some yeses and some nos. Good, we'll cover that. What's the host range? You can shout out anything that makes sense.
Everything.
That's a pretty good answer so far as we know so far. And is there anything we should be doing about it? Yes, that's always a good answer. There's almost always yes, we should be doing something about it. And then is there any good news? I'll answer that one. I think the answer is yes. Yep. CRISPR? Oh, I haven't heard about that, so you could bring that up at the end. So, is that the answer he gives to everything? So, if you haven't heard of it, spotted lanternfly is a plant hopper. It's from China, and it has moved across the universe, actually, no, just the world, and came in, they believe, on stones. Egg masses came in on stone brought from Korea, I think, as far as they understand. It was introduced to Korea about the same time it was introduced to the United States, which is around 2014. So you can see it is a beautiful insect if you happen to like insects. Let's see, do I have a pointer? I don't know. Oops, that's always a bad thing to do. I won't do that again. One of the things I want you to note, though, is the size markers. And you can see it's not, the actual size is not this big, but it is ½ an inch. And I'm going to pass these around. These are not great, but they at least show you how big the insect is that we're talking about. So the adult's about an inch. You notice them when they fly into you. They're pretty big, and they do fly. They also hop. They're good hoppers. They're plant hoppers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it, but you'll see this kind of picture gets put out a lot because one of the things we're most interested in is that people are looking for it and identifying it. So if it does occur in New York State, we'll know about it. So here's the answer to that first question. Are there spotted lanternfly populations in New York State? At the moment, as far as we know, scientists, we have to qualify everything. There are no existing populations in the state. But if you look at all these orange spots, those are all times that it has been found. For example, Monroe County, they found at least 37 in an order of Christmas trees that were brought up from Pennsylvania, cut Christmas trees. It was first identified actually in Dutchess County, and it was in a pharmacological warehouse. Somebody noticed it. And that's when that's the first time they found it in New York State. So it was introduced right around here in Pennsylvania, and it has spread since 2014. That looks pretty bad, like it's spreading, it's continuing to spread, and it is. Every time I go and look for this map, which the current map is on the New York State Integrated Pest Management website, I have to keep making it's bigger. It takes up more space because it keeps adding more states for locations, either where it's existing populations, blue or yellow, where they found it, and not a population. So it looks bad, but the thing to me that's absolutely amazing, it is not yet. There is no known populations yet in New York State. And everyone assumed that we would get it last summer, that we would have it last summer. We don't have it yet. What does that say to you?
Winter happens.
What's that?
Winter happens.
Well, not that, because you're right that the winters are cold enough to kill the adults. They're not cold enough to kill the egg masses. What it means to me is we've done a good job of keeping an eye out for it and preventing it from coming in. So, and Pennsylvania is doing a ton of work and are very generous in sharing things with us. So not yet in New York State. So it's not here. Why should we talk about it? Start looking at the numbers and losses from Pennsylvania. We'll give you an indication of why we'd like to keep it out as long as possible and also be ready for it when it gets here. So the ag department, so $18 million in plant-based commodities in the state. That doesn't include homeowner business tourism losses, Pennsylvania has added $3 billion to their state budget to control it. They have, I think, 4 full-time hotline people to answer calls when people call that they are reporting it or that they want to know if they found it. They also have the problem that people are calling 911, so they have ads out that say, please don't call 911 for spotted lanternfly. They also have a lot of, you can get spotted lanternfly earrings, you can get socks, welcome hats, all sorts of things. So it is a beautiful insect. So one of the things is, why is it such a problem? It's easy to kill with pesticides. It's a little hard to catch them. They're good jumpers. Does this picture give you any idea why they might be hard to kill? Say that again? The egg masses in particular are hard to see. The adults are pretty easy to see. But look at the numbers. It occurs in huge numbers. I have never seen insects that mass like that. It would seem contraindicated in that, they're all sharing the same phloem source. So they're all competing with each other, but they are very happy together, unfortunately. So what's one thing that you notice from this picture with the apple trees in it?
Apple tree looks fine.
The tree looks fine? The leaves are still okay. What really looks fine? The fruit. They don't feed on the fruit. They feed in the woody tissue. So they're feeding in the phloem. So they're sap suckers. And they're really, they look at this picture, they look kind of malevolent. These are not actually their eyes. Their eyes are up there, but the orange spots make them look like they're really dangerous. But look at the mouth parts. I don't know if you can see with the lights on, but the mouth parts go right into the twig. But this twig is a lot woodier than you're going to see usual plant hoppers feeding on. So they're big. They're strong enough to get their mouth parts into that woody tissue, and then they tap into the phloem. They don't actually have very much of a suction, but it just kind of sort of moves through them pretty easily. And the moving through is another issue. Oh, I can handle it. I saw that, and if I'd known about it, I would have tried it. So they produce a huge amount of honeydew. Oh, that's much better, thank you. So if you look at this bottom step, that's the one they've cleaned off. The other two still have the honeydew on them. And if you think about that number of insects in a tree, you can imagine that there's a lot of honeydew. Let's see if we can make this work. So they have swarm feeding. Again, they're not really feeding. There's some on the fruit, but they're not actually attached. It's the ones that aren't moving much that are plugged in. And you can see this one up here. There's some of you can see their mouth parts. But look at that. That's the honeydew squirting out. It's like a squirt gun. So when you're talking amounts, and that's just one. With that mass of them there, I mean, underneath, you can see it's just going to be sun. And then you get sooty mold developing in them, in the honeydew, etc. So it can actually help kill some plants. So this is a vineyard in Pennsylvania, and you can see the vines here don't look very happy and are dead. Actually, what they think is the feeding on the plants affected them enough that then they were winter killed. So it wasn't that the insects directly killed them, but they led to their demise. And they do fly, and they move from feeding site to feeding site. So this looks like I've photoshopped spotted lanternfly in there, but actually it's a clip from a video, and all those things that look kind of like birds are actually spotted lanternflies moving. And they're moving either into or out of this apple orchard. So it's big, there's lots of them, and it can move itself around. It also isn't very fussy where it lays eggs. Again, from the point of view of development of an insect, it seems very odd to put your eggs on something they can't feed on, but they like rusty metal. And if this is at the bottom of a planter, so if your great aunt Agatha gave you a planter to take back from Pennsylvania, you wouldn't necessarily think that that's something you needed to remove. It looks like mud. And that's what they do. They cover their eggs. So here's egg masses. The eggs are laid, and they cover them with kind of this muddy substance. And it dries and turns darker brown and looks very much like bark. So here's somebody scraping them. We'll talk about that in a minute. But they lay them on anything that's outside, and they lay a lot of egg masses all at the same time. And other spotted lanternflies seem to lay them again in the same location. And it's a really good hitchhiker. So can you see the numbers here on this tire? Now, at least on the tire, many of them will be run over, but not all of them. And so they do everything in a group. They're not great individualists. They're doing everything together. So if you've got numbers like that, trying to make sure that you've cleaned them all off a vehicle before it goes anywhere is tough. So if you think about this location, here's Philadelphia. Think about the transportation that goes through Philadelphia. It's amazing, and a lot of it comes north, and it comes into New York State. So this actually is another clip from a video, but there's a spotted lanternfly on a tree, there's the train. And if you think about the kind of area around train tracks, nobody's managing it very much. So it's, and it was going pretty slowly. It would be easy enough for a spotted lanternfly adult to hop on and find a place where it didn't get blown off and move. In fact, the reason I said on boats too is there was a boat that came from Philadelphia Harbor into New York, and it was quarantined before it was allowed to land, to dock, because they found spotted lanternfly on the boat, and they had to clean it up before they would let it dock. So it can come in lots of ways. It's very easy for it to hide in places. I think with the Christmas trees, what we think is they actually liked, the adults were all dead, but they seemed to crawl into the wrapping. So they also seem to like to be in sort of tight places, which also makes it harder to find them. So, okay, are you all scared now? It was in the, that's the reason too why we believe it is definitely coming. So here's about the host range. And I think this is what we know. And every time I see a list, it's got more things on it. At first it was mostly trees and shrubs. Now we're seeing things like basil and cucumbers and soybeans and statice and lots of other things. But there's also this difference between what it's feeding on and what it's laying its eggs on. It lays its eggs on lots of stuff. So we have had one case of an egg mass coming in on nursery stock into Long Island. We have, as well as we've had, I'm sure we've had other cases of things coming in. That's the one that I've heard of. But so the Christmas trees, you don't see anything that's what we use as Christmas trees on this host range list, but it will lay its eggs on Christmas tree bark. And that's one thing we're worried about, because who's looking for the egg masses? Hopefully the growers are. But once they're in this, so once you have them, you bring it in your house. Actually, it would be an advantage if the egg mass would hatch. It would freak people out and we'd hear screaming. So I don't think it's happened yet. But the problem is you keep it in your house a little bit of time and then you throw it out. Now you've got an egg mass that's sitting outside. The eggs aren't killed by the cold and they will hatch out at some point. So the feeding versus egg laying has some importance both for moving it around and then also for the damage that it's likely to cause. So even where maples are one of the more or less preferred hosts, part of the problem is not that they're feeding on the maple, but that they're dropping honeydew down below and it's in landscape settings. So we know a little bit about them. Tree of Heaven is a preferred host, as it showed before. We think it's a required host. We also think that's the reason that things don't eat them, because they acquire a toxin from feeding on Tree of Heaven. So they don't taste good. And if you saw the picture of the insect, I'm going to give you an entomology quiz now. What's the one thing about the picture of the insect which might let you believe that it doesn't taste good? It's red. Yep, so they're red. So Tree of Heaven, they seem to be on any time. Grape, they seem to be on any time, both wild and cultivated grape. But there is a preference for 4th instar through adult for the Tree of Heaven. So it makes the one advantage on that is that you can use Tree of Heaven as a place to both scout and potentially treat the insect. And they're seeing that they sort of move over time. So on some things like rose, you find the nymphs, but you don't see the adults there. And there seems to be some preference for the late season adults for things like silver maple and willow. So again, everything that we know a little bit, and we may find out more information. As I said, in Pennsylvania, they're doing a lot of research on it. We're not doing quite so much here because we don't have it and we don't want to bring it in. There is some research that's going on in New York State though. So what should we be doing about it? Learn to identify it is the first thing. That's kind of why I'm giving this presentation. One is, okay, many of you had heard about it. Would you have been able to identify it before I gave the talk? Good, we've got some nodding and we've got some no's. So at least there's a reason to do this talk. So learning to identify it and looking for it is one thing that we can be doing in New York State. So again, the life stages, they're big and they're beautiful. And that maybe helps, I don't know. But it's the egg masses that I think are the hard part to find, just because they're meant to be cryptic. And again, I think I showed this, so you can see the eggs and then they get covered with the mud. And then the mud often turns kind of brown. You won't find all stages all the time, so the life cycle has some importance in terms of identifying it and looking for it to know what you're looking for. So eggs are there for a long time. They actually start laying eggs in September and they can be there all the way through June. So that's an advantage there, is you've got a long time to find them before they start hatching out. Then you get the first instars hatching out in the spring, and you don't get fourth instars and the adults until later in the summer. And then the adults, it shows that it says July to December. They are killed by the cold temperatures, but if it's warm enough, they will stick around that long. So this is based on Pennsylvania. So it's going to be similar to what we would see here, we think. But there's always just enough difference. That's one of the good news points that I'll get to at the end. So what to look for? Honeydew, wasps and bees feeding on the honeydew, the black sooty mold on the honeydew. You can actually see, this is a terrible slide, but there's a group of spotted lanternfly here on this trunk, and then you can see that it's weeping. So that's, again, will help you. You do get some you can get flagging on the branches, but of course we can get flagging on branches for other reasons, so you need to go look to make sure that this flagging is actually caused by spotted lanternfly. I must turn, and all of a sudden it sounds very loud. So hopefully I'm not blasting any of you out. If you're looking for information on identification or lots of other pieces, New York State IPM has a lot on our website. We're one of the partners in New York State's sort of plan of attack for spotted lanternfly. And so, as I said, the most current map is always on our website. And there's other things. Anytime something comes up, it usually gets added here, and then we create some of it also. So nys.ipm.cornell.edu, that's us. Sorry, nysipm@cornell.edu. No extra dot. Another thing that we can learn to do is identify tree of heaven. How many people can identify tree of heaven? Good, I'm glad to see that at least the front row should be able to identify it. How many do we have some in the Botanic Gardens? Yes. Undoubtedly. There are many, many places. And so one of the things to look for when the seeds are on, it's pretty easy. It's a compound leaf, so that's a little, there are some things, other things that look like it, but very few things have this little node on the bottom of the leaf. So that's one of the indicators. It's also reported to smell like rancid peanut butter, rancid other things, feet, I've heard. So if you're out walking around and you smell feet, look for
China's stinking tree.
Stinking tree, so that's so that's one thing, is to identify where they are, and then actually mapping them. And if you can get rid of them, that's a good thing too. Now, this is a nice specimen tree. No one's gonna, not very likely, go out there and cut it down. So that one you may not take out. If you're in a more wild area or woody edges, you might actually try and remove them. They are fairly hard to kill. You can't just cut them down because you'll have more. So they do what they call the hack and squirt method, where you cut into essentially just under the bark, and then you apply the herbicide there, and that will kill the tree. If you're only going to kill one, kill a female. It's kind of sad, but that's because they're producing seeds, and they're very good invasive, and they will grow more trees from seeds. So if you can get rid of the females, even if you leave the males, that's still an advantage. And then anything that's left is used as a place to scout. So because they have to be there, and especially when the adults are out, you can go look at those trees, or actually put sticky traps on those trees to see if you're finding any spotted lanternfly. And so when they found it, when we've had areas where they found some, they do a lot of this around the areas, is go scout the tree of heaven and do other things to make sure that there is not a population.
Betsy?
Mm-hmm.
So you're suggesting that we just take out the lampas so that we don't have to deal with?
Well, yes, is that going to get rid of the problem? No. But because they tend to be an attractive thing where it'll pull them in, they're actually using them as trap trees. So you keep some and get rid of the others, and that way it makes it easier. You can treat the ones that are left with a systemic pesticide, and then that's a way to, and that seems to work on controlling spotted lanternfly. It's a good way to get the control with using the least amount of pesticide also. So at this point, I mean, if you can get rid of some of them so that you're not having to scout all of them, that also helps. But yes, it's one thing to say that when we don't have it yet. It's like, well, I'll wait till they get here. And that's understandable.
So it's fairly certain that if you have that tree, you're going to get that one first. So
apparently they seem to like that. They are preferred, and they seem to have to feed on them. So in a landscape, well, I say that as far as we know. And so, for example, if you have them, they come into, and there's maples around and they're happy on the maples, they may not immediately move to the tree of heaven. So, but it is in terms of a place that they seem to require feeding there, that they will eventually end up there. So if you find anything that you think might be spotted lanternfly, even if you're not quite sure and you might be wrong, still scrape eggs into the hand sanitizer alcohol. If you can catch the other stages, put them in alcohol or freeze them. The nymphs and the fourth instars just run, they don't jump, so they're a little bit easier to catch. They're pretty fast though. And then you can send pictures and the location information to spotted lanternfly at agriculture.newyork.gov. Some of the older information says DEC because DEC was originally the spot to send them to. Now it's the Department of Ag and Markets. So now we also have an external quarantine. And what's a quarantine?
We can put them on a ship, the lid's there.
That's right. These days, it has to do with tour boats. That's right. In this case, we have an external quarantine because we don't have them yet. So what we have is a quarantine that's limiting access to movement of things from someplace into New York. So anywhere that has a red line around it. That's interesting. There are some places that they know they have populations that are not yet in our quarantine, but that one is, but most of Pennsylvania, most of the other sites. It's some of these areas in New Jersey that we're kind of worried about because they're pretty close. And I think they've maybe found some even closer to New York there. But so it's an external quarantine. That means that you have to consider what's happening, what's moving through that area, any of those areas into New York State. So how do you know where it is if you're in Pennsylvania? Actually, the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture has this website. If you Google them and put in spotted lanternfly in quarantine, there's a button for an interactive map. You can put in an address and it will pop up whether or not it's in the quarantine zone or not. So it's like, well, that seems like kind of overkill. I'm just going on vacation. But you can bring them back from being on vacation as well. So that's actually Brian Eschenauer's parents' house. So if you're a commercial business and you're bringing anything in, not just if you're doing the trucking, but if anything is coming in, and again, this Christmas tree issue is one of them. So if you're bringing in anything, the regulated articles include all plants and plant parts, any stage of the insect, and anything reasonably believed to be infested with or harboring. That's like anything that might be sitting outside, vehicles, everything else, and all plant parts, and any stage of the insect. So it's a very broad quarantine. Sometimes in quarantines we say you can't bring anything that would, like you can't bring this fruit in or you can't bring this plant in. If we did this, we would actually stop all commerce because potentially anything that's outside, it could be on. So instead of saying you can't bring it, if you have any of those articles, you have to have a certificate of inspection. You have to have a waybill with where it originated and where it's supposed to be going. And the companies that you're buying from are supposed to provide those. And then you should know something about how it was shipped and loaded and everything else. So again, there's the link for the Department of Ag and Markets. They have a lot of information on this quarantine. But so this is an issue that does affect New York growers and other people that are bringing plant material. So I've already had a call from somebody growing blueberries who wanted to know if it was okay. I don't even work on blueberries, but wanted to know if it was okay to bring in blueberry plants from Pennsylvania. And I said, well, certainly, just inspect them, make sure that they, he's like, no, I can't do it. I have to get them from Maine now. So that's the small example, but I suspect that means that we are seeing economic effects and we'll see more as they come along. This is one of the DOT inspection spots. So if you can see that, and they're stopping trucks, they're stopping vehicles along the roads coming in from Pennsylvania and actually inspecting them. They have spotted lanternfly sniffing dogs also, which is pretty cool. So if it's a personal trip, the thing is, if you're going to be driving through the quarantine zone, don't stop if you don't have to. If you do, check your vehicle inside and out. They like to get inside cars for some reason. And I know someone was scouting. It was a scout that was writing an article, and they said, yep, they stopped at the gas station, and they were just about to go into Maryland before it was in Maryland, and just looked in their trunk, and one had climbed in the trunk. So they, for some reason, like to go visiting. And if you're moving anything that's been left outside, inspect it, especially for the egg masses. So they're starting to put out, again, documents like this, looking at the plants and plant parts, but looking at packing material, looking at landscape materials, looking at anything that's been left outside. And you can, even if you're a public citizen, but you happen to go in and out of Pennsylvania a lot, you can get a permit. It's pretty easy online training to get the permit. In fact, people from Pennsylvania were speaking for us. And they said, yeah, they had to make so many that they don't even have nice plastic ones now. They're just paper because there were so many that the people were requesting. So are we ready in New York State? I think we are as ready as we can be. They actually created something called an incident command group, just like for battles, where they brought in all these collaborators, Ag and Markets, DEC, Parks, IPM, and other people to say, all right, what do you need to know? Who's doing what piece? What do we need to know? And what do we need to do? So we have this concept of protective zones. If they found any stage, they will make a protective zone around it and check very heavily to see if there are any populations there. They have the checkpoints on the roads. We actually do have lists of 2EE lists of pesticides already. The labels are already ready. They're not out yet because we don't have the insect, but as soon as the insect is determined to be here, then those will become available so that we don't have to wait, because it often takes a little bit of time to get a special needs permit for, or license, or sorry, not license, but label for a pesticide. So this way they're already ready to go. And they are looking at those for secondary effects on pollinators, because we're trying not to cause harm in the process of causing good. And then we're looking at this concept of training for management methods. I have some handouts up here that are from Pennsylvania that have a lot of the information on how to manage them and how to look for them and so forth, so if anyone's interested. And bumper stickers. There's a lot of swag. Pennsylvania is doing, as I said, a lot of research, and they're sharing all of it, which is very, very helpful. So this is one of their management calendars that they've created, but they're also doing research on a lot of the different things, not just management methods, but biology and movement. What are the effects on different hosts? Insecticide trials. Are there pheromones? So can we create traps? So make it easier to catch them. And more. If you ever get a chance to hear the groups from Pennsylvania speak, they have just amazing amounts of work that they're doing, and really helpful. So, is there good news? I think so. They don't bite, they don't sting, and they're not structural pests, and they're not here yet. Those are all good news. Those are all points of good news, but I think there's even more. So there are some things that will eat them. Now, when you look at the numbers, it's very unlikely that you're going to have a good biological control for that many insects in one place to have something eat them all. But there are some that are being fed on. So anyone that's gone, I suspect, that helps. They're not laying eggs. There is some biological control. They found that the egg parasitoid for gypsy moth actually was found infesting spotted lanternfly eggs. And they've got 2 additional ones from China that are in quarantine for potential release. But what's something about these egg masses that you notice that looks different? Yes, tell if you've been paying attention. Yep.
They stack geometrically on each other.
Yep, so they lay eggs one in rows. That's how they lay them. Is there something missing?
Mud.
There's no mud. So once they're covered with mud, they're less likely to be attacked by an egg parasitoid. So this is a little wasp that lays its egg into the egg, lays its egg inside the egg of the spotted lanternfly. So they don't always get them all covered, but most of them are. So again, that has some potential, and they found, I think, levels of maybe 20% infestation, but not enough to give you good control. These are my favorite, though. Yep.
So has there been a study of the biological process by which these lanternflies create this whatever muddy excretion? Like, has there been an analysis of the chemical composition of it?
Not that I know, but that's a good point. He was asking if there's been any study of the mud and the chemical composition of the mud, and so whether or not that's actually repelling the insects or it's just the physical process that they can't lay an egg through it. I think all of that is up for grabs. Now there's research also going on in Korea, and in China they're under control because they've got the natural enemies and so forth. This is the work, and actually this is some of the work that's being done at Cornell, is on the biological or entomopathogenic fungi, actually. So the first one is Beauveria bassiana, so you can see a nicely fuzzy adult there. So it's infected with a fungus, and from what I know about Beauveria bassiana, because it is one of the entomopathogens that we use in greenhouse production, so it's currently being produced commercially, so you can actually buy it and apply it. In some insects, they shed their skins too fast, and so they kind of slough it off so they're not infected. This has got a long period of development, and so I think it's one where it actually can be controlled, and you can get some killing of the insect with the Beauveria bassiana. So it just infects the body and kills the insect. This one is my favorite, though, this Batcoa major, and it's native. They found it being infected in Pennsylvania. So you notice this one has its wings outspread. And you also can maybe see there are little fungal strands that attach it to that leaf. So the fungus infects the insect. It actually makes it climb up higher than normal. So now it's above the population below, causes it to open its wings and attaches it to the plant with these little fungal strands so it doesn't fall off. So there's a rain of spores falling down on the adults below. Sounds great. So, but it's pretty amazing to me that that's what the fungus can do to the insect. So, so that one, again, looks like that's native but not commercially available, so it has some potential. So they're actually trying spraying Beauveria bassiana to see if they can get control, but the Beccoa they have to do more work on. So the other thing that has some potential good news is, so the adults will die with the cold, the eggs survive, but they're looking at the concept of growing degree days. How many people know what growing degree days are? Few. So the idea of you need a certain amount of temperature to go through the stages of development of the insect. And if there's not enough temperature or not enough heat units, they won't go all the way through development. So there's some indication that in parts of New York State at any rate, there are not enough growing degree days for the insect to complete its life cycle, and that might halt. So you'll have either fewer or no eggs laid. So that's a good sign for us. And they don't really know exactly. They think up along the lakes is actually a good place for the insects to survive. Adirondacks, not so much, but even there's some talk that the southern tier is not so good. Fortunately, we grow a lot of grapes and apples up around the lake. So in terms of production, that's a problem. So I think that's everything that I have. So again, I love Pennsylvania's got some really entertaining advertising, gross, effective, necessary. I don't think you can squash them all that easily. Maybe that's a larval stage. But I'm happy to answer questions if I can. So I'll be nice to Geneva, and I'm going to ask Geneva first. So Geneva, do you have any questions?
That was a wonderful talk, and we don't have any. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you. All right, does anyone have questions here? Yes.
Betsy, I thought your fun fact was going to be that you met Julia Childs.
Oh, well, now I have to think of another one for the next time I give a seminar.
Right.
Maybe everyone will forget.
I
I did meet Julia.
was curious if you're hearing reports from Pennsylvania about lots of agronomic damage. Like, is there indeed lots of agronomic damage? Have they had to do lots of pesticide spraying?
So they are doing lots of pesticide spraying, not just for the agronomic damage, but also for the landscape issues. And so where they've seen the most damage that I've heard, sorry, if I didn't ask the question again, have they seen economic damage in Pennsylvania? Where they've seen the most is in grapes. And hops, they keep talking about hops, but I haven't seen pictures like the one with the vineyard where you can actually see the plants are dead. And the apples, I guess, those apples, the fruit's not affected, but if you were someone harvesting by hand out in there with that many insects and that much goo around, even if the apples are fine, you may have to now do washing or other things in terms of getting the honeydew and the sooty mold off them. So I don't think they have, I have not seen great information on other plant damage. And I think a lot of it is, again, to me, if you look at those little, they said you could find them on basil. They've got such big mouth parts, they'd go right through the stems of basil, you'd think, and they'd probably suck it dry pretty quickly. So I was kind of surprised to see some of those more herbaceous things on the list. But, yep.
So in addition to the two pathogens that you showed us,
Mm-hmm.
are there other natural predators in the native range of the insect?
So the question is, are there other predators or other biological control organisms in the native range? Yes, so those two little wasps that they were bringing in that are under quarantine that they're studying now, those are both from China and we don't have them. But of course, it's not a fast process then because you have to bring them in and test them on all sorts of things to make sure that they're not going to feed on anything that we actually want or damage anything else that's native here. So the fact that they found the one that's the egg parasitoid of gypsy moth is surprising. They're not related. But so maybe it's a wasp. It's like there's an egg. We can figure out how to parasitize it. But so and then whether or not there are other entomopathogenic or fungi or other things like that that they might bring in. I haven't heard of anything but those two that they're working on. Someone had a question back there. Yeah.
In the native range, how cold is it like compared to New York?
So if the question was in the native range, how cold is it compared to New York? I don't know the absolute answer on that. Certainly, I've seen maps where they think it could survive. And it, once you're getting up much farther than New York State, it looks like they've got it as too cold. But it may well be that it's not the temperature it's not a temperature that's killing the eggs. And I don't know the absolute temperature for killing the eggs. My thought is that it's quite low, which is unfortunate. We'd like to kill the eggs. Any other questions? Yep.
In somewhat related sense, I mean, Korea's not that far from China. Why has it only been very recent that?
And that's also a good question. And I don't know that it's through all of China. I can go and look. There is a map that they have that's at least the proposed distribution throughout the world. And yeah, so especially if it's moving on things like stone. So if there's trade between the two places, you would think that that would be an easy way for it to get there. And why it didn't get there until 2014, or about then too, I don't know.
Was it native range like southern China, or was it
I
not?
don't know, I'm gonna have to go look that up.
Seems like the native range is more like Vietnam, from what I've read.
Have you? Yeah, so maybe it's farther south. Any other questions? Do you know anything about CRISPR and spotted lanternfly?
Other than the stuff that, no, not specifically with this, but it's being touted as the
It's gonna save us all.
for everything. But this is more of a comment rather than a question. Along highways, there are rest stops and things like that. If I were going to have observation posts, whatever they might be, I'd look at rest stops.
I think that's where they're put.
secondarily,
I think they're putting them there and for the trucks at the weighing stations.
Yeah,
Like
and
Atlantis.
there are very frequently, I notice tree of heaven growing around freeway exchanges, the bridges and things. So that would both be maybe a place to concentrate eradication efforts, although perhaps not in Brooklyn. And,
Because this is a tree that grows in Brooklyn.
right. And also maybe have concentrate scouting efforts where you have these sequential satellite installations.
And they may well be doing that in Pennsylvania, but I think they're also doing it in New York. And yes, the concept of, because tree of heaven is kind of a trash tree in a way, and it ends up and it spreads, and you see a lot of it along roadways and so forth. We did a program down in Westchester about the time when the seeds were out, and it looked like everywhere we drove all the way along the roads, it's all tree of heaven. Because it's a little bit hard to kill, that also means that people aren't controlling it, and it's areas where people aren't doing much management. But you're absolutely right. So if you can use tree of heaven in the areas where you think you might see it as it's moving outside of the zone it's in now, certainly scouting and using those trees as trap trees and places to treat with pesticide is a great way to do it. They're also doing a lot of trapping. In fact, they have sticky traps that they're using, and they found that they actually had to put cages over them because they were getting other things like birds even stuck to the sticky trap. So now they're trying to make the wire mesh so that the spotted lanternfly, which actually goes up and down the trunk to some extent when they're young, that they'll get stuck and other things won't. But so you can do the trapping and other things. And that, you're absolutely right. It makes sense to do them places where your vehicles are going to stop and places that are going to have tree of heaven to make it easy on yourself. Yep.
What's the plan for CRISPR to save the world?
We'll have that conversation afterwards.
Longer than it takes now. Yeah. Yes, Nina.
Have they found it a lot in urban areas where there's a lot of Atlantis potentially in unmanaged sites?
Yes, there's a lot of.
Is there enough for them to feed on? So, I've heard about the Atlantis issue, and I just wonder because they're everywhere.
Right. So it'd be nice if we had very rarely, and they had to be there, would make it easier to use that as a management tool. But because they're everywhere and they're in places that people aren't really looking, it makes it a little bit harder to use as a perfect management tool. Early on, and I don't remember exactly either where it was, I saw a video that was a building, and there were piles of dead ones along the sidewalks. Do you remember? Somebody else is nodding. And I don't know if they even know why they died, but just the numbers were amazing. And it was clearly in an urban area. You could go online, you can find bars that have competitions for how many you could swat with a fly swatter. I've seen, actually, they made beer coasters and wine coasters that are to promote knowing what spotted lanternfly is and getting rid of it and contacting the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. As I say, I found maybe it's a non-welcome mat, a welcome mat with a spotted lanternfly on it. You can get socks with spotted lanternflies. People are making jewelry out of real ones. So people are taking it as on the challenge, but I think people, if you look at the house where the steps that were coated and everything else, we don't need anything else that's going to convince people that they don't want to go outside. And to me, like if you're standing under a maple tree, there was someone doing a report and they're standing under a maple tree and they've got an umbrella. And I realized, oh, that's the honeydew dripping that they're trying to avoid. So that's another, that whole issue of homeowners and tourists and everything else is, I think they're thinking of it. I don't think we've counted what it's going to cost. So we don't want them. So please don't bring them. So I tell all my growers, it's like, you do not want to be the place where they say, oh, this is where the population started. So even if your plant is not a host, be careful. So any other questions?
What about wild, you said grapes and lantus are the two.
Yeah, so wild grapes.
Wild grapes, I mean, they're everywhere as well.
Right.
Yeah, and also, most of the plants that there seem to be using are sun-loving plants. So.
Oh, that's an interesting point.
Shady areas, or is this just a sun-loving?
I don't know. Yeah, that's a good point. So what Nina's saying is that the plants on the list tend to be sun-loving plants, and whether or not you wouldn't find them in shady areas as much. I don't know the answer to that at all. I haven't seen anybody talk about that. But as I say, I think we're still, even though, I mean, that's 6 years that it's been in Pennsylvania, and certainly we're still figuring things out. So, and then there's even in terms of the map, you know, people don't want to have their state put on the map, or they don't want to have their county put on the map. So we're trying to even get that. Yes.
Is there any role for, I'm trying to think where it, endopesticides, pesticides that are
Biologically based pesticides?
it's in systemic pesticides. If these are sap.
Yes. So the question is if there's any role for systemic pesticides. And yes, what they tend to use when they're using those tree of heaven as trap trees is they're actually using a systemic insecticide in those. So when the insects feed on it, they'll die. And that's what they're looking at primarily because, again, trying to spray something and get good contact over that number of insects when they move around so much, a systemic is a much better idea. And again, you can get away with, you can use less pesticide and get more effect and have it be really spot treatment and in a controlled sort of application, which from IPM point of view, we like. Yes.
If they could get a trap that was more attractive to the insect than the average automobile, they could stick it
Yes.
that would be like the first.
And make it look like a big spotted lanternfly. So he's saying, could you get something that's more attractive than the average car just sitting out there?
No, like a screening trap.
Right.
Check the trap. If it's not there, you don't check the car. If it's there, you check the car.
Well, they're looking for pheromones. And so if you can find something that would be, even if it's not enough to trap them, to control them, but it's enough to tell you that they're around. And that's why having something like a spotted lanternfly sniffing dog, they did have one situation where the dog kept pointing, saying it's here, and they couldn't find it. And they did finally find it inside the grill of the vehicle. And so they're well trained. But so yeah, something like that where it's a faster means of doing it, because thinking about trying to clean off every vehicle that's going down the highway, Route 15 into New York, or 81 into New York, is just almost an impossible idea. So having something that could check more easily would be great. So that I'm sure somebody's working on it.
Well, thanks so much, Betsy.
Thank you.
Really enlightening talk.
Okay, now I can see if
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.